There's just something about machine quilting swirls. But if you've been trying to learn how to quilt this design and been struggling, good news is I'm here to help. Hey everybody, it's me, Angela Walters from quiltingismytherapy.com, and welcome to the Mastering Swirls Free Motion Challenge Quilting Along. In this free video series, we're going to learn how to master the swirls quilting design by learning how to quilt it and also how to use it in different areas of our quilts. In this first video, I'm going to show you the basics of quilting the swirl meander. I'm going to break it down step by step. I'm going to show you what it looks like on a sewing machine and a long arm, and help you troubleshoot some common swirl quilting frustrations. And then in the next video, I'm gonna show you how to use that swirl in different areas of your quilts. And I'll be showing you how to quilt the designs on this panel that I designed just for the Free Motion Challenge. Be sure to check out all the exclusive products I put together for this free video series, including this fabric panel, optional borders, and even a coordinating thread collection. To learn more about all of those, just click the link in the description box below, or you can visit quiltingismytherapy.com. Now, before we get to actually learning the swirl design, if you already have your own swirl style, don't change it. Your swirl might have a different shape or look different, but as long as you love it, that's all that matters. But if you haven't found your swirl style yet, let me show you how the design goes together. So to create the design, I'm first gonna start by quilting a small curl, then echoing back around it. Once I have that first swirl, I'm going to quilt another one by quilting a curl and then echoing back around. But with this design, I'm going to stop before I run into a previously quilted swirl. There's no touching or traveling with this design. So as soon as the foot of my machine approaches that previously quilted swirl, I'm going to stop and quilt my next one. Now, as I'm quilting these swirls, I'm not worried about which direction they're facing. I'm not even too worried about how curvy they are. I'm just trying to get to the center and then echo my way back out. So let's do a couple more. Now there's one more step to creating a beautiful swirl meander, and that is echoing. I'm going to use echoing to maneuver my way around the area. If I don't, I'm going to start getting swirls that kind of go in a row, which is fine, but that's not necessarily the look that I'm going for. So from this point, I'm going to echo around that previously quilted swirl and then continue quilting my swirls. Keeping the spacing consistent between the echo lines and the swirls will help it all blend in together. As you're working your way through the area, there's no set number of times you have to echo. Just pause, look where you need to go, and use echoing to help get you there. The main idea here is I want the quilting to be almost like a blob. I want it to kind of build out from that first swirl and handle any gaps while I'm there. I always say that I think people will notice a gap in the quilting before they notice an error, so as long as the whole thing is filled in, it's going to look great. If you're newer to quilting swirls, here's a couple tips that might help you out. First, I want to quilt my swirls so they're kind of on the smaller side. It's much easier to quilt a smaller swirl than a bigger one. So I'm kind of aiming for roughly between the size of a nickel or a quarter. Another thing that will really help is something I've already mentioned, and that's handling the gaps while I'm there. Notice that this whole area is filled in. There's no big unquilted areas that I have to come back and finish later. Having that consistently filled in area will help those individual swirls kind of blend into each other and help kind of hide any swirls that maybe aren't as good as another. One thing that really helped me when I started quilting swirls was to use my finger to kind of trace through the path that I wanted to take. Doing this helps me kind of visualize where I want to go and kind of gets my mind wrapped around the path. Another thing that will really help no matter which kind of design you're quilting is to make sure you have your hands on both sides of the needle. When your hands are positioned on both sides of the needle, that's where you'll have the most control of your quilting. If at any point you find your hands are not on both sides of the needle, you need to pause, reposition, and continue on. A quick caveat here. If you're newer to quilting, it might be tempting to try to reposition your hands while you're quilting. Don't do that. Make sure you stop, reposition your hands, and continue on. It's hard enough to quilt swirls with both of your hands on the quilt. It's even harder if you take one of them off. The biggest part about learning how to quilt swirls just comes down to practice. You just keep at it, keep going, and I promise each time you quilt, they'll refine themselves and they'll look better and better. And as I'm quilting, if I find an unquilted area, I'm going to use echoing to maneuver my way there and fill it in. Well, now that we've seen kind of how the swirl design goes together, let's see what it looks like to quilt it on a Longarm quilting machine. When it comes to quilting the swirls design on a Longarm quilting machine, the design comes together the exact same way. I'm still quilting my swirl and echoing around it, trying to keep the spacing consistent between those lines. Then continuing on, quilting another swirl. And as you quilt, don't forget that you can use echoing to maneuver your way around the area. I would say the biggest frustration about quilting swirls on a sewing machine and a Longarm would be not getting those nice round curves. And that's especially true on a Longarm quilting machine. The way a Longarm moves, it actually has two sets of wheels, one that goes horizontal and one that goes vertical. So to create those curves, I actually need to engage both sets of wheels in a smooth, continuous motion. I mean, if you think about it, it's kind of like trying to draw a swirl with an Etch-a-Sketch. So if I'm learning a new design and I'm not feeling comfortable moving confidently through that shape, then I'm gonna see those more squared off swirls. But don't let it discourage you. The more you practice, the more comfortable you'll get with the design and the curvier, rounder your swirls will look. And as you're filling up the quilt with your swirls, if you get to an area where there's not quite enough room for a whole swirl, just quilt an echo line that works its way in there. Remember, as long as the whole thing is filled in, it's gonna look great. Like I said, the swirl design is the most versatile, beautiful quilting design. I mean, at least in my opinion. And it's definitely worth learning. So keep practicing, keep after it, because I promise, the more you do it, the more refined it gets and the more beautiful it looks. Now, if you've been trying to learn the swirl design and haven't been successful, try not to be discouraged. But I do have some tips on how to troubleshoot and hopefully avoid some common swirl frustrations. So swirl frustration number one, the swirls all seem to go in the same direction. If you're trying to quilt that swirl meander and you notice that your swirls are all kind of heading in a single direction, that's not necessarily the end of the world. It's just that in a meandering design, we want it to go in all different directions and give us a nice all over texture. If you find that you're getting something like this, it just means that you're not echoing enough. So after you quilt that swirl, be sure to use echoing to help you maneuver your way around the area and to keep your swirls all from going in one direction. Common swirl frustration number two, squared swirls. This is probably the number one common frustration when it comes to quilting the swirl design. If you're seeing a more squared off shape, one possible thing you can do to kind of fix that is to focus on your momentum. That means I'm not gonna pause a lot while I'm quilting or stop halfway through the swirl and kind of obsess with what it's looking like. I'm gonna focus on keeping going. Another thing that could be causing this is a little bit more difficult to diagnose since I can't talk to you specifically, but most quilters, when they're learning a new design, quilt too slowly. If I think about quilting that curved line, quilting it quicker will result in a smoother, curvier line. That's because I don't have time to correct myself as I'm going. Now, I don't want you to quilt so fast that you're out of control, but I don't want you to quilt so slow that you can critique the job you're doing while you're doing it. That's too slow. So kind of play around with the speed of your machine, looking ahead and just trusting your hands to bring you to it. And I bet you those swirls will work themselves out. And then common frustration number three, my swirls just don't look right. Sometimes it seems like we can do all the steps just like we watched them and it still doesn't look quite right. But even if it doesn't look exactly like mine, as long as it's consistent and fills in the whole area, it's gonna be fine. But if you're looking at your swirls and you're like, I'm not quite sure if that's right, here's a couple things you can try. If you have swirls that look something like this, what's happening here is I'm not finishing my swirl before I branch off into the next one. I'm quilting the first one and then going into the next one and moving on. So when I'm quilting that swirl design, remember, I'm gonna come into that point and I'm gonna come back around and then add the next one. And another thing you can do if your swirls just aren't quite looking right, focus on the spacing between your lines. As you get more comfortable with the design, it'll be easier and easier to keep that spacing consistent. But if I have a design like this where some of the lines are closer together and some are further apart, it's just gonna kind of give me a different look than that nice all over design that I'm going for. So I'm gonna try to quilt those lines so that they're the same distance apart, but I promise, no matter what common frustrations you're dealing with, the more you practice, the better you'll get at it. Well, now that we've seen how the swirl design goes together and how we can troubleshoot common problems, let's take this design and learn how to use it in other areas of our quilts. And we're gonna do that in this next video. And then to learn more about the Free Motion Challenge Quilting Along or to get your hands on any of these exclusive products, just click the link in the description box below or visit quiltingismytherapy.com.